The Frank G. Zarb School of Business and WRHU-FM Radio Hofstra University invite you inside the Z-Suite.
Hello, I'm Janet Lenihan, Dean at the Frank G. Zarb School of Business at Hofstra University. Welcome to Inside the Z-Suite, where we explore leadership, innovation, and the forces shaping business today. Today, we are going to reflect on one of the most remarkable business transformations in modern history and look ahead to one of the most disruptive forces shaping the future of work, artificial intelligence. Joining me for this conversation is Doug Maine, Senior Advisor to Brown Brothers Harriman & Company, a privately owned financial services firm on Wall Street with a 200-year history. Doug serves on the boards of VIA, OlympusAT, Quest Technologies, Palladian Artist, and Seismic, companies spanning industry from edge computing and IT services to media and robotics. Earlier in his career, he served on the boards of over a dozen public and private companies, all of which were acquired by strategic or financial investors. Doug joined IBM in 1998 as Chief Financial Officer and Senior Vice President, later acting as General Manager of 2 operating units, before retiring in 2005. Before joining IBM, he spent 20 years at MCI Communications, where he eventually served as Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer. During his tenure, he played a key role in transforming MCI from a bankrupt startup into a Fortune 50 company that was sold for nearly $40 billion. Doug holds a BS from Temple University and an MBA from Hofstra University, where he serves as chair of the Zarb School of Business Dean's Advisory Board. On a personal note, Doug has chaired our advisory board for the entire time I've had the privilege of serving as dean, a partnership that has truly been invaluable to me personally and to our school's success. He is also an executive resident at Columbia's Business School and a former member of the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board Standing Advisory Group. Doug, welcome inside the Z-Suite.
Thank you, Janet. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is so great to have you, and I'm really excited about this conversation. Before we dive into MCI, and I know we have a lot to unpack there, it struck me that you've really always had a front row seat to major waves of technological disruption. And so talk a little bit about what experiences early in your finance career prepared you to recognize and, most importantly, bet on world-changing technologies before the rest of the market really took hold.
Well, if I had to pin it down to a few things, one is I would say I'm just inherently curious about things. My mind generally leads to, gee, I wonder how money can be made or lost on the thing that I'm curious on. Where do I find out about all these technologies and so forth? That's basically through reading. When I came to Hofstra in the 1970s, I subscribed to all the business magazines, Business Week, Forbes, Fortune, so forth. I started the Wall Street Journal back when I came to Hofstra itself. And of course, through today, I read those and you pick up a lot from them. One of the things, though, that I did, we'll get to MCI in a moment, early on when I first came to MCI, this was a whole new world to me from a technology standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, a legal standpoint, a competitive standpoint, and so forth. I went up to the assistant for the CEO and chairman and founder, and I asked her to tell me everything that the CEO subscribed to. And she came back with his reading list, and I subscribed to everything that Bill McGowan subscribed to. And as a result of that, I learned things that virtually all the other employees didn't know, and it was simply because I was reading the same thing that the guy on top read. So that's really how I think I came to start following all these technologies.
That was a stroke of brilliance and great advice for anyone listening. All right, so let's take you back to MCI. 1978, bankrupt company, competing against really the behemoth, AT&T in the industry. What made you say yes to joining MCI and joining their kind of David and Goliath fight that it's been likened to?
Well, it was certainly a David and Goliath. MCI was basically a startup when I joined. I'm going to use the expression AT&T in this conversation. AT&T, for most of its existence, was not only the long-distance company. I'll define what that means in a minute. But it was also the local company. So there was something called the Bell system throughout the United States. In this area was New York Tel was the Bell company. And they provided local service and so forth. You add up all the revenues, the profits, and the employees of this behemoth, this Goliath, and it was far and away the largest company in the world. You could take the next 6 Fortune 500 companies, add Exxon, General Motors, Ford, add them all together, and they still wouldn't equal the size of AT&T. So it truly was a Goliath. Why was I so uninformed, maybe I'll say that, to gamble my
Ignorance is bliss.
my career on taking on the largest company in the world? Really, I give it credit to Hofstra, because I was in the MBA program at Hofstra, and I was nearing the end. I was in my last semester at school. I was in a corporate finance class, and I showed up early for the class. And there were a couple of students that likewise were early. They decided to go to the professor, and they asked the professor the simple question: if you were us and you were graduating this semester, what kind of company or what kind of situation would you be looking for a career standpoint? By the way, that era, most of us at Hofstra, we were looking to join a big, well-known Fortune 500 company, big bank, or even IBM, a company like that. The professor said words that were really probably the most influential thing that I've ever had. And I overheard this. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to the 2 other students. He said, if I were you, I would join a small, high-tech firm. And that way your career will grow as the company grew. Well, that was like foreign language. First off, he said small, not large. And then he said high tech, and at that point in time, there was basically IBM and 6 other companies, most of which don't exist today, that were the tech industry. It was nothing like what we have today. Ultimately, what happened, a recruiter came on behalf of MCI, which was headquartered in Washington, D.C., and made a pitch for me to join them. And I went down, interviewed, and I liked the people I met with, and I joined them. But I would not have joined at all if I hadn't heard a credible source, a Hofstra professor, basically say, here's what I would do. I would join a small high-tech firm. I have to really give Hofstra credit for that, because without hearing that, I wouldn't have even bothered that. The other thing I have to say, I want to just describe what telecommunications was like back in 1978, because it's radically different than what it is today. So the telephone service had been around for about 100 years up to that point. It was provided, telephone service in every country of the world, the U.S. included, was basically provided by a monopoly phone company. Oftentimes, the monopoly phone company was actually owned by the post office and so forth. Up until mid-1950s or so, that's the way phone companies provided service. Now, what happened is they would build out their networks in cities where it was economically feasible for them to make a profit, but they would ignore rural locations. The U.S. Congress did not like that. And so they basically cut a deal with AT&T and the Bell system that Congress would allow AT&T and the Bell system to continue operating as a monopoly, i.e. the world's largest company, in exchange for them basically providing affordable local phone service throughout the United States. The reason that's important is that the way AT&T did that was basically through a pricing mechanism. What they did was they segregated their business between local service, think of that as just Metro New York service, versus everything else. Everything else was called long distance. That was the term that was used. What they ended up doing was charging an arm and a leg for a long distance call. So this is now back in the 50s or 60s. A call from New York to Chicago was over $1 a minute. In those dollars, today it would be, worth $3 or $4 a minute. And the local service was then inexpensive. So who would pay $1 a minute for a long-distance call? Well, certainly not residential customers, unless you were calling your mother on Mother's Day. It was basically business. So business was essentially funding what's called universal service to provide a low-cost phone service throughout the United States itself. And it was kind of an arbitrary thing that happened. So MCI, when it was founded, was completely completely focused for the first 10 or 15 years of the company's history on the business market. Why? Because that's where the money was. And that's how we got started. And I'll come back to that point a little later as we go on.
Interesting. First of all, I love the story about the Hofstra professor, right? Because that's what makes Hofstra so special, the impact that our professors can have on young minds and young students. So just fascinating. So you're now at MCI going up against AT&T for that business segment of the market.
Yeah.
Was there a point in time where you really thought to yourself, we could do this? We might be able to dethrone AT&T? And if so, what were the indicators? What were you looking at?
I should mention early on, because you'll hear us as we go through this, to mention a number of things where MCI was the first or the leader, but we were clearly the first competitor anywhere in the world to the local phone company. That's frankly the most important thing about MCI because we started competition. And as I indicated earlier, we started competition really for business customers. So Janet, to your point, was there a point when I basically saw that we could be successful? There are actually two things I'll say. The first having to do with business customers. We knew businesses, particularly large businesses, had it with subsidizing universal service. They were mad. They wanted an alternative. This was expensive and so forth. And so the biggest of the big, I'm talking about General Motors and Exxon and so on, they were threatening to build their own telephone networks at the time in competition. So MCI came along and we knew that that was the case, that we could get 10 to 20% market share simply by being an alternative to AT&T. All we had to do was finance and build a network to reach those companies. But that was really what the mission was. And I knew that because I didn't mention this early on, even though I had been hired into MCI to start a FP&A organization of financial planning and analysis. MCI didn't have the money to afford to allow me to do that, so they put me in charge of billing. So I was in charge of billing and certainly well aware of who the customers were. And our initial customers that essentially funded MCI in the early days were the car companies, General Motors, Ford, et al. It was the airlines, and it was the Wall Street firms. They were our customers that got in early and essentially provided enough money for us to go. So that was one thing I knew. But then I'm going to turn the clock forward a little bit to tell you, I think you'll find this an interesting story, a little media story here. So it's now 1982. I joined in 1978. And in 1982, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, decided on a different way to levy the costs that the long-distance carriers had to pay to the local phone companies to originate and complete a call. Eyes are glazing over when I mention that as a concept, but it was important. Remember what MCI had, what AT&T long distance had was a long distance network. We served between New York and Chicago, not within New York, not within Chicago. So if you placed a phone call from your home in Chicago, you had to somehow get it to MCI or to AT&T, and you did that through the same local network. The way the local phone companies were compensated for that was through something that the FCC called access charges. We hated it. I hated it all the time. I was with MCI. It was 40 cents on every revenue dollar went to them to complete a one or 2 mile call. That's just the way it was. But in 1982, what happened was the FCC changed the formula for how those charges were assessed. And I remember myself and a colleague, a guy named Frank McBride, we stayed up one night trying to figure out a way economically that MCI could go after the residential market. Remember, we're only in the business market, the residential market, and actually make money. And lo and behold, we figured out a way to do that. So MCI decided we were going to try to go after the residential market. The residential market, by the way, is about the same size as the business market if you split the revenues up. So we decided to do test marketing, which was new to MCI. We hired an advertising agency who created some ads, and we decided that Denver was going to be our initial test market. We ran the first ads on the Today Show, which, as you may know, starts at 7 a.m. This is how unsophisticated we were. our people, our employees in Denver who had to answer the call if anyone called in. We didn't know if anyone would respond to the ad. They didn't start work till 9 o'clock. So it goes on the Today Show. The phones are lighting up. No one's there to answer the phones and so forth. So around 9 o'clock, the employees go in and they see every button is lit up and so forth with people wanting it. And that news then filtered back to corporate headquarters where I was. And I knew immediately we've got something here for the residential market. And turned the clock forward, MCI ended up with 20% or so market share of the residential market, serving something like 25 million homes and so forth. But that's how it all started.
So you figured out how to answer the phone, right?
We did figure out that.
But, I've heard you say, right, that MCI was very much a marketing story, too.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a stroke of genius, getting on the Today Show, once you figured out how to get your employees over in Denver to answer the calls, right?
Yeah, right.
Anything else that you did to capture that market share?
We did a lot, and I did a little boning up for this session to basically see what ChatGPT and Gemini would say about MCI. And they're giving MCI credit for inventing social media marketing, which I had never thought of, but I'll describe the program in a minute. So what happened is that over time, the gap between what MCI was charging versus what our competitors were charging, what happened is there were more competitors now than just AT&T long distance. Sprint is a name that the audience probably knows, was another competitor and so forth. So we decided we had to find different ways to compete other than simply being the lowest price phone company. So we turned really to marketing to do that. And we had a number of programs. We had loyalty programs. So if you were an MCI customer for a certain period of time, you ended up getting some sort of rewards or lower prices. We had parody ads that mocked AT&T. AT&T had basically institutional ads, feel-good ads. Call your daughter on Mother's Day. She calls you and everybody feels good. So MCI made fun of all of that with humor and irreverence. So AT&T had people you've never heard of as their spokespeople. We had Joan Rivers, we had Whoopi Goldberg, we had Billy Crystal, we had Michael Jordan, who's not a comedian, and others that were our spokespeople. And our ads were very well known around the United States. The program, though, I wanted to call out, the one that is now being credited for kind of the start of social media marketing, was called Friends and Family. Essentially, it was a pricing gimmick. If customers would name, I think it was up to 6 friends and family, calls to those individuals would be at a deep discount to what the calls to the rest of the people were. That was the program. In order to do that, it required us to essentially do social media marketing and so forth. So it was there. We're going to talk about the internet in a moment. As you'll soon hear, MCI was very much involved at the start of the internet. One of the things we had to do was basically introduce the internet to the full audience. And we did that through marketing and through advertising. We had a young 12-year-old Australian actress, Anna Paquin, who's still an actress today. She was our spokesperson. Basically, we called the internet Network MCI. The whole idea of the ads was basically to paint a picture that we all today would be very comfortable as knowing of what the internet could do. But back in the early 1990s, people didn't know what it was. So that would be another example of it. And the last one I'll point out that was always my favorite was international calling, because the price to call from country A to country B was really ridiculous. In the United States, for instance, to call Pakistan, that's one I remember, was something like $7 or $8 a minute. What happened, the way the structure of sharing of call revenue was done was through a bizarre process, which I really won't describe. But the key thing to know is that people from the United States were far more likely to call an international destination than the reverse. So we had plenty of people calling Pakistan, but very few people from Pakistan calling the United States. And the way this process worked, that meant the U.S. ended up subsidizing every phone company in the world because of this bizarre way that everything was structured. AT&T controlled 100% of that market. Now, this is up through basically the mid-1980s. So the only way you could call Pakistan was over AT&T. So MCI, we wanted a piece of that. Ultimately, we went to the local authorities around the world, and nobody would agree to do a deal with us until we went to New Zealand, who agreed to do a deal. And we started with New Zealand, and that was kind of the first one. And then other countries ended up following. The reason this was important is that although international revenue ultimately was never more than 15% of MCI's total revenue, it represented almost half of our profits because it was far and away the most profitable part of our business. I loved it, certainly as CFO. The more international calling we could get, the better.
That's great. It's also really represents just the entrepreneurial spirit of MCI and the resiliency that you kept trying and you were willing to take risks.
Yeah,
whereas AT&T was kind of, very bureaucratic at that point.
No
right?
question about it.
You know? And so that does lead us to the conversation about the internet because you've described this as your kind of, your epiphany moment.
Yeah.
Why?
So I won't try to go through the whole history of the internet other than to say through its early founding, the only real users of the internet were college students, college professors, hobbyists, and so forth. It was a thing. It didn't work very well. Certainly businesses would stay as far away from it as they possibly could. And largely the reason for that was because the network that was carrying the internet was really an inferior network. It was something called NSFNet, which stood for National Science Foundation Network, and it was just a horrible, slow network. And so at some point, the National Science Foundation said, we want out of this. We want to privatize the internet. And basically, they put out requests for proposal for bids on it. So this would have been 1992 or 3. I was chief financial officer, and we had a couple of executives. One man named Vint Cerf, who, if you follow the internet, you would know him. He's known as the father of the internet. He co-wrote TCP/IP, which we still use. For the last 20 years, he's worked for Google as titles Internet Evangelist and so forth. But Vint was one of our employees, and Vint and our head of engineering, basically, they wanted to bid for this thing. And the cost was 40 or 50 million. I don't remember the dollar amount. So they kind of did an end run for me. I'm the CFO. And they went to the CEO and said, we think we should bid for this. And so he asked the question that I'm going to come to. He basically says, what are we going to get out of this? What's the financial play? Well, they had no answer, didn't have the slightest idea. So he said, if you can convince the CFO, me, to go along with this, I'll go along and support it, and then we'll take it to the board of directors and get it done. So Dick Liebeber was his name. Dick knocks on my door, comes into my office, and basically says, I want to tell you about this. Our CEO has said that you're going to be the decision maker on this. Okay. And he said, it has to do with the internet. So my eyes are starting to roll. I said, the only thing I know about the internet is Time Magazine had done a cover story on it, which I had read, which basically was very consumer-oriented in terms of what the future of the internet was going to be. I said, give me your take on what this internet can be and what's the usefulness of it. And he started going through, basically reciting what I had learned from Time Magazine. But my epiphany, as I'm listening to this thing, now remember, MCI came from a commercial background. We did have residential, but we were really business. And I said to myself, if we go and we build this thing, and it has the performance, that's a telecom term, that basically has the quality and security that business wants, I bet you we can get business to really want to utilize the internet. And that was my epiphany. So I said, okay, I'll support it to the board of directors. Okay, so 2 weeks later, the board is meeting, and I've got to go and present this thing, $40 or $50 million. And of course, I know they're going to say, what's going to be the ROI on this? And I have no answer. None. The CFO has no answer, which why in God's name do we make you CFO if you can't do that? So I went to Vint Cerf and I said, what the hell am I going to say? And he said, tell them it's like the gold rush. He said, the miners didn't make any money. It was the people that offered the picks and shovels and covered wagons. So help me God, that was my justification. I said, I'm not sure how we're going to make money, but this is going to be like the gold rush of 1848, and we're going to do it. And so we ended up being selected. It was our network that was the foundation for that. And then over time, of course, businesses came on to it and so forth.
Just incredible. I heard you say it was the best business decision you ever made. And that's for sure, right? Now, at the time, what was the board's reaction? Like, what were the internal debates happening?
Huge, obviously, question on what the ROI was itself. I didn't make this point. MCI had the very first commercial email system. That's why we hired Vince Surfin to bring email. So we had some experience with electronic mail. The big challenge was our investors. Now, investors, I'll talk a little Wall Street here. One thing that investors hate is when a company, oftentimes a founder, CEO-led company, actually does what Wall Street calls a science project. What they mean by a science project, it's something that's of interest to the company, but they don't think it's really going to amount to anything, and it's going to be a distraction from them. And by the way, when they chose to invest, they weren't choosing to invest on the back of the science project. It was based upon the base business itself. So my big challenge was, how do I basically convince our investors to stay in with us, because we knew what was going. I couldn't get away with picks and shovels and covered wagons. So I must have conjured up, I don't quite remember, some sort of ROI that said if things happen and so forth, we'll get through it. And my memory is we did not lose a lot of investors on it, but they were hardly cheering us on as it related to the internet back then.
But I'm sure at the end they were.
Yeah, at the end they were.
So I have to ask, I understand Rupert Murdoch influences this story a little bit.
Yeah.
How did his perspective on the internet reinforce or maybe accelerate your beliefs?
Okay, so I have to mention a man named Michael Milken, because he's very fundamental to the story here. Most of the audience probably does not recognize Mike's name at all, but he was terribly, terribly important to the expansion of really worldwide business back in the 1980s. A quick story on Mike. He was a Wharton Business School student. He learned while he was at Wharton a key fact, and the key fact was the fact that lower-rated companies, I'm talking about rated by the rating agencies such as Standard & Poor's and Moody's that rate your bonds. Lower-rated bonds, he found out, were no more likely to default than the best-rated bonds. Well, what was really important about that is that the way bond prices were set, the way big banks determined if they were going to offer bonds on your behalf, was really rated to the credit capability. And there was this incorrect assumption. The big companies, the more important, the bulletproof, the AT&Ts and Exxons, so forth, that their bonds were going to be a better credit risk than some no-name company. Mike saw that that really was not the case, in fact, even though that had been the belief. And so he set about to basically become what became known as the junk bond king of Wall Street. And he was the one person that was willing to fund startup companies, earlier stage companies such as MCI. So Mike was really our guy that raised money for us. And I remember at the time, we needed $500 million. So we asked Mike, can you raise $500 million? By the way, there had never been as much as $1 billion raised in one offering at the time.
Wow.
So Mike says, yeah, I can do it. I think I can do it. So he went on to talk to the people that invested in his securities, and he came back and told us he could raise $2 billion on our behalf. Well, I mean, it was like, you've got to be kidding. That's never been done. So we ended up settling for $1 billion, which at the time was the largest single bond offering in history done on that. And then Mike continued as we went on and grew to lead all that. He did it through essentially using convertible debt, which I won't go through what that means other than it was a cheap way to sell equity at a 25% markup from what your stock price was. At any rate, so what's Mike got to do with Rupert Murdoch? Mike was the one that introduced MCI to Rupert Murdoch. He knew Rupert because Rupert was also one that used Mike for raising money. Rupert, at the time, had basically figured out what the internet And what he called going digital was going to do to every business he was involved in. Now, his company called News Corporation at the time owned Fox. It wasn't Fox Television. I'll get to that story in a minute. But Fox Films. He owned a lot of newspapers, and he owned publishing companies and so forth. And he knew, his expression was, eyeballs were going to be moving online. He knew there were going to be lower distribution costs. He knew there would be new ad opportunities for it. He had it all thought out. What he really needed, though, was a way to take advantage of all this. And so he needed a distribution company. And Milken saw that MCI did that, and that's how we got together. We, MCI, ended up investing $2 billion in News Corporation. We own 13% of News. Rupert joined our board of directors. Our CEO joined the News Corp directors, and we basically became, to some extent, one company. Now, the story that has nothing to do with anything else we're talking about, but I may as well say it because you've never heard it. Now, I'm CFO. I would have to recognize 13% of all the profits, or lack thereof, the News Corporation on MCI's books. So I was very careful about that. And I was trying to be a CFO and exercise some judgment. So Rupert comes forward and he says, I'm going to create Fox News. And at the time, so this would have been 1995, there was no Fox News at all, but there were plenty of news stations at this point in time, a lot of media stations and so forth. So I said, I remember where we were sitting at the time, right across, Janet, from you and me, and I said, Rupert, why does the world need yet another news station? I've got 13% of this, this thing's going to lose money. His line was, more news, less talk, and that was it. What he did not say, though, that I'll divulge here. He did not say to offer a conservative point of view. Now, we all know Fox today. So I don't think that the way it ended up being what we know as a Fox News was really in Rupert's thinking. He must have blessed it. I think it was Roger Ailes that really came up with everything that made Fox News the way it is today. So that's a little sideline. It has nothing to do with anything else, but I thought I'd weave it
interesting piece of history, and it also just shows how interrelated organizations are, right?
That's right.
That people don't even realize it.
That's right.
So now take us to the sale. $40 billion. I mean, astronomical sum of money. So what led you there, and how did you really begin to understand the value of the firm and the future of the industry?
Like a lot of what happened, it was really due to circumstances. And the circumstances I lay on none other than Bill Clinton as basically the bad guy in all of this. What happened, so we're now into 1995, 96, and I'm feeling pretty good about MCI at this time. Business is going well. We've got this relationship with Rupert Murdoch. We're right at the start of the internet. I didn't mention this. British Telecom had invested almost $5 billion and owned 20% of MCI. We had the second phone company now in Mexico. Things are looking pretty good to us until Bill Clinton. So what happened was the local Bell operating companies, I'll use New York Telephone as an example, lobbied Congress to essentially get into the long-distance business. The reason that's important, back in the 90s, if you were a customer, you actually had to have two phone bills. You had to select a local phone company, and you had to select a long-distance company.
I was an MCI customer, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. So the local companies lobbied Congress, lobbied the administration, and got something called the Telecom Act of 1996, signed by Clinton, that basically allowed the local phone companies into the long-distance market. It conversely allowed long distance in the local, but we couldn't go out and build a network and so forth. I knew our residential business, 25 million households, was toast. I knew it was going to go away because why would you want two phone bills if you can get the same service from New York Tel that you have with two today? So that was the threat that was going to happen. Secondly, as much as I had started to be bullish about the internet, it was still the early days. I didn't know where this was going to end. I thought we'd sell some picks and shovels, but I didn't know where the thing was going to end as well. And the last thing I would say is nothing but greed, and I'll cite that. Most of our compensation as executives at MCI was in stock. And so we needed a high stock price in order to compensate ourselves. The Telecom Act, as soon as investors understood that, the stock was going to decline. So we needed a solution for it. It was actually me, I'll take credit or blame as the story goes on for this. I'm the one that said, let's merge with British Telecom. Time doesn't permit me to get into all of that. That was the solution. Big phone company with lots of money, already owned an interest in it. And I ended up cutting a deal with them. What happened was that ultimately a company called WorldCom came in with a big topping bid. On top of that, we were essentially forced legally to go with WorldCom. So we ended up selling the company to WorldCom. And time, thankfully, doesn't permit to go through the whole history of WorldCom and what happened. But the net is that MCI/WorldCom became bankrupt again. Yeah. And I had left, been gone by 3 or 4 years when all that happened and so forth. But it was obviously not a good ending for the company itself.
It's a fascinating story. You see so many parallels to what's happening today in terms of the disruption that you noticed and really got ahead of in terms of the internet. And now this is what CFOs and CEOs are tackling now in terms of the disruption that AI is going to have on just the way we work, right? And organizations perform. Talk a little bit about those similarities. And I know you're talking with CEOs all the time. What are some of your conversations about? Are there any lessons they can learn from you making the best business decision of your life back then and adapting the internet? Any lessons there?
I would say there are a lot of common parallels I see with AI now and then what I've been talking about. I rattle them off. You have a technical breakthrough that's happening before mainstream understanding. Well, that's the same. You'll have a platform shift on how information flows. You'll have commercial adoption, I believe, is overhyped today and somewhat uneven, and they'll be changing business models. All of that is really very much the same. The key thing I would say, though, how's AI going to play out? One significant difference between the scenario that I went through with MCI, and that's the speed of things. What I describe happened over decades and so forth. Now this is happening in months and weeks and days and so forth. So there's more peril with that, but also chances of companies, perhaps ones we've never even heard of, almost overnight to become huge successes. I would challenge anyone listening to this who had heard of NVIDIA 4 years ago. So that's just an example. And I've actually done a bit of studying on AI myself. I think that every company, at least, will use it for productivity enhancements. It's just too obvious to not do that. So I think that will happen. The real gold mine is going to be on inventing new services and products that rely on it. That's not going to be in everybody. Just like the internet today, who had heard of Facebook and Google 20 years ago? We'll have, I think, the same thing happen. There'll be a handful of companies that will figure out a way to bring a unique product and service to the market, and they'll become enormously successful on the back of it. It's exciting times to live in. I just wish it would slow down a little bit so we could keep up with it.
No, it is fascinating, and I could keep asking you questions because this has been just so interesting. We are at the point in our interview here at Inside the Z-Suite where we'd like to ask our guests just some fun questions that we're going to ask you to answer off the top of your head. Are you ready?
Oh, boy.
All right. If you could trade places with anyone or anything, who or what would it be?
George Clooney.
A great answer. All right. What is your favorite household chore?
Favorite. I can do the least favorite.
All right, start there. What's your least favorite?
Taking out the trash is my least favorite. That's one of the few things I can handle with it.
And it's always there, right?
Yeah. Favorite, I would say taking care of the dogs. That would probably be my favorite.
That's great. All right, and this is the final question.
Okay.
For the students in the audience who are listening, what is the key to success?
I would say the word that comes to my mind is perseverance. I've had some success in business in my life, and I don't think of myself as the smartest or the most ingenious or what have you, but I just keep at it and keep at it and keep working. And secondly, I would say don't be afraid of failure. I probably said some stupid things on this call, as I do, and I have lots of stupid ideas, particularly at my age. I'm not worried about being the smartest person in the class or saying something that's wrong. So I would say stick to it and don't get tied up and worry about what people think, whether the risk is going to be too high.
Doug, that is such fantastic advice. And I'm so grateful for you joining us today. Really just so interesting to hear about a company that for many was long forgotten, but so many interesting parallels to what the decisions you made then to what CEOs and CFOs are thinking about today. So thank you for being here. I want to also thank our producer, Adrian Stoller, and WRHU engineer, John Mullen. Be sure to tune in to Inside the Z-Suite on WRHU 88.7 FM or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about the Zarb School of Business, visit hofstra.edu/business. Until next time, I'm Janet Lenihan from Inside the Z-Suite.